Lately, it seems like we are hearing more and more rumors about a plan being hatched to deal with the problem of the national debt. And no, I don't mean pay it off. Right now, the national debt is over $36 trillion. However, the total number of dollars in existence in the entire US financial system is only $21.6 trillion. So even if somehow the US government was able to confiscate every single dollar in the entire financial system and use those dollars to try and pay back their debt, there would still be $15 trillion left over unpaid. In other words, it cannot simply be paid off. But on the other hand, it's not like the US can just go to everybody that they borrowed money from and say, well, we're just not gonna pay you back. That's because US debt is considered the bedrock of the global financial system, and there is no way to predict the catastrophe that could result from the US just deciding to default on all of its debt. So how in the world are they planning on dealing with this seemingly unfixable problem? Well, some people are pointing to the fact that Trump has recently alluded to the United States actually having less debt than we think due to fraud. President Trump suggested that the $36 trillion of national debt may not actually be that high. He added that it could be that a lot of those things don't count. In other words, some of the stuff we're finding is very fraudulent, therefore maybe we have less debt than we thought. Now, I would not be surprised at all if there was some level of fraud or technical issues within the US Treasury system that allowed for something like this. But most likely, it's not gonna make a dent. But just to be generous for the sake of argument here, let's say there's $2 trillion of the national debt that actually doesn't exist. So right off the top, we can take the national debt down from 36 trillion to 34 trillion. Now let's take one more step forward. Considering the fact that the United States government owes some of its debt to itself, we can reduce that number even further. In other words, while the total national debt pile is above $36 trillion, the total debt that's actually held by the public is only $28.9 trillion. Different agencies and departments and branches within the US government itself hold on to treasuries, which means some of these treasuries, when they get paid back, that interest goes into the budget of the department that was holding on to those treasuries, which pays for some future expenses. So we can take this step safely and say that the national debt is actually $28.9 trillion. When we subtract from that number the potential fraudulent debt that Trump was talking about, now our total debt pile is sitting at $26.9 trillion. But wait, there's more. We can take one more step and look at the amount of debt that the US government owes to the Federal Reserve. Remember, the Federal Reserve prints money and buys assets with that newly printed cash, and much of that is US Treasuries, which means the Federal Reserve itself is owed money from the US government. The total balance sheet right now is around $6.8 trillion, and of that, about $4.7 trillion is US Treasuries. Now, when the Federal Reserve runs a profit, in other words, all of the assets that it holds on its balance sheet here pay income, when that income exceeds the expenses at the Federal Reserve, all that extra income goes straight back to the government. It goes paid back to the Treasury Department, which means if we want to take one more step and be generous here, we can say that all of the national debt owned by the Federal Reserve does not count, which brings our total national debt pile down to $22.2 trillion. So we started out at $36.2 trillion and got all the way down to $22.2 trillion. A $14 trillion reduction in the national debt just by taking some generous liberties with fraud, intra-government held debt, and debt held by the Federal Reserve. But there's a problem. We're still at $22 trillion. And remember, the entire money supply in the US financial system is $21.6 trillion. So again, even if the government were to be able to take every dollar out of the system and use it to pay off the debt, it still wouldn't cover it. And obviously something like that is not even possible. I'm just using that as a demonstration to show the magnitude of the problem. So given that, what is the plan? There are two categories of solutions, and we are already starting to see some of them go into effect, but we will see all of these over the next 4 years. The two categories are produce and print. Every solution that tries to deal with the problem of the debt will fall into either the production solution camp or the printing solution camp. Some of these we are already starting to see. Let's start off with production. First one of these is very simple. It is tax cuts. And here's why I say it's very simple. When the government takes less of your money and leaves that money in your hands, you get to be more productive. Pushing this to its extreme, most people lose about half of their income throughout the year to various forms of taxation. In a perfect world, imagine you were able to keep all of it. That means you would effectively double your income overnight. How much better off would your life be? You'd be able to afford healthier food. Maybe your spouse wouldn't have to work. You'd be able to afford better activities for you and your family, to have better relationships. Maybe you wouldn't have to spend so much money on maintaining old broken things. Maybe you'd be able to save more for rainy days instead of having to rely on high interest credit card debt. Maybe even be able to invest for the future. And if you being able to keep more of your own income would improve your life, it would also improve the lives of everybody else around you because you'd be saving more, investing more, and spending more economic activity, in other words. Now imagine the positive feedback loop from everybody being in the same boat as you are. And that is what tax cuts do to an economy. When you allow individuals to just keep more of what they've earned and what belongs to them, people are more productive. They make better decisions and their lives get better, and so do the lives of everybody else around them as a result. The economy grows stronger and faster as well. But by itself, that solution doesn't really do anything in the long run, especially because we're talking about the massive problem of the national debt. And if the government just lowers taxes without doing anything to spending, the only thing they do is they grow the debt pile faster, which contributes to the printing solutions that we're going to talk about in just a moment, which is why you need to pair it with the second solution under production, which is cutting government spending. We are already starting to see very small savings and reductions in government spending. And you can track these yourself by going to doge.gov and seeing some of the things that the government is cutting spending on and how much money they are saving you. There are a couple of reasons why cutting government spending results in higher production from the economy. Number one, every dollar the government spends is a misallocation of resources. This is a little bit of a technical economic discussion, but the logic goes as follows. Number one, value is subjective. Number two, value is ordinally ranked. This means I personally value my mouse pad more than I value my pen. It doesn't mean the mouse pad is objectively more valuable than my pen, because let's say you're stranded on a desert island and you need to put a message in a bottle. For you, a pen that you can write on something like paper would be far more valuable than something that needs electricity like a mouse pad. Number three, humans will always optimize their actions for the highest value that they can possibly get, given the scarcity of time and resources. Which means if I have the choice, I very well may prefer to buy a $10,000 car instead of a $20,000 car so that I can pay cash instead of getting a loan. And then finally, all government action is there to change human action, which means when a government passes some regulation and spends money in a way to enforce that regulation for, let's say, I don't know, safety features or beeping features or camera features on a car that make it more expensive, it changes human behavior and we are forced to buy the $20,000 car instead of the $10,000 car that we would have otherwise. Therefore, every dollar the government spends is a misallocation of resources and results in less overall wealth than there would be otherwise, which means that cutting spending means they add to this debt problem at a slower pace. They misallocate fewer resources, which means that those resources are left in the place where they can produce the most wealth. And then finally, reductions in government spending slowly spiral. In other words, right now, the US government spends $1.2 trillion per year just on the interest on the debt. Every single time they have to pay debt off, they have to borrow new debt in order to get the money for that. Right now, they're paying off a lot of debt that has a lower interest rate. 1%, 2%, 3%, but they're replacing it with debt that has a higher interest rate, which means that as the national debt is growing, the cost of just holding that national debt grows exponentially because you have to pay interest on all the debt, but the interest rate on all that debt is also growing. And so the more they cut spending, the slower that exponential increase happens. So under the production bucket of solutions, we have lower taxes, we have lower spending, and the third one is going to be lower regulations. In other words, deregulation. Doge.gov/regulations shows the current number of rules and regulations passed by executive branch agencies, in addition to the laws that are passed by Congress every year. Every single one of these rules, regulations, and laws are there to change human behavior and cause something to happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise. This makes virtually all business in the economy more expensive than it would be otherwise. A great example of this is the chicken tax, where cargo vehicles have a higher tariff than passenger vehicles. So for years, what Ford would do is they would make passenger vans, full-size 12-seater passenger vans with all the seat belts and seats included, import those for the lower tariff, and once they're across the border, they would pay people to remove those seats and seatbelts to turn them into cargo vans. And even though they were wasting money on all of the people they were employing to do all this unnecessary work, wasting money on all the resources that they were wasting for all these unnecessary parts, it was still cheaper than just importing the cargo van. And all of that waste translates to more cost for the end consumer. This is a simple example of virtually every single law, rule, and regulation that applies to humans and the way we interact with each other. And the more we cut down on these rules and regulations and laws means more prosperity for everyone. And before all the authoritarians go absolutely wild in the comment section saying, well, let's just go back to the Wild West then, that worked out great for everybody. First of all, yes, it did. But second of all, there's still liability. If you do something that harms somebody, you are still liable. The laws and the regulations and the rules don't change any of that. They're trying to be preventative, and they just cause unnecessary cost increases. If I make a product that's defective and I hurt somebody, I can still lose everything. In other words, liability is better than law. Okay, so those are all the solutions in the production camp. What about the printing camp? One thing we are almost certain to see is a return to quantitative easing. In other words, the Federal Reserve buying assets on its balance sheet yet again. This is because interest rates continue to climb higher and higher for US debt. That means there is less and less demand for that US debt. And as the government borrows more and spends more, that trend will continue. Further than that, like we discussed earlier, all of the profit that the Federal Reserve receives from its balance sheet gets paid to the government. Now, right now, they are not turning a profit. They hold a bunch of debt at really low interest rates, but that will change because interest rates have been a lot higher for some time now. And so thinking about this through the lens of years and decades, we're gonna see the Fed turn profitable again. And all that means is that all the interest that the government is paying to the Fed goes right back to the government. And so it's in the US government's best interest to try and get the Fed to purchase as much of the national debt as possible, because then it becomes interest-free. In other words, this number would go to zero. The $1.2 trillion the US government is currently paying in interest on its debt, if the government was able to get the Fed to buy up all the national debt, would essentially go to zero because the government pays all that interest to the Fed and it all goes right back to the government, which wouldn't stop the growth of the national debt, but it would severely slow it down, considering right now this number is climbing by over $1 trillion a year just because of the interest. But Jerome Powell has been pretty clear that he doesn't see a return to quantitative easing anytime soon. He said we would need inflation numbers at or below 2%. We would need interest rates at 0%. I don't see that happening anytime soon. So we could get a stealth QE instead through the banking system. Right now, banks are limited in how many US treasuries they can buy by risk parameters set by the government. And that makes sense because if a bank buys a bunch of US treasuries and then the value of those treasuries fall as interest rates rise, then that bank could be at risk of a bank run like we saw happen with Silicon Valley Bank a few years ago. However, a few changes over the last couple of years mean that treasuries could be viewed as reserves for banks. If banks get into trouble and they need to sell their treasuries, but those treasuries aren't currently worth what they would get if they were to hold them till maturity, they could temporarily sell those treasuries to the Fed for the full price. This means that with a few changes to banking regulations, banks could theoretically start buying an unlimited number of US treasuries with no restriction and no risk. Because interest rates and prices of bonds are inversely correlated, this increased demand for US treasuries could drive interest rates on those treasuries much, much lower, which would help to drive this cost just the interest on the national debt down a lot lower. Now, we all know, and many of us were expecting, that geopolitical instability would increase under President Trump. Whether they're just negotiation tactics or actual policies being pursued, we see ideas like tariffs and annexations and changes to our relationships with former allies thrown around all day long every day. This could lead to some nations deciding they don't want to hold on to US debt anymore, sparking more selling of US treasuries. And when push comes to shove, that could be something that causes the Fed to buy those treasuries, like we discussed earlier. Now, the final solution under the printing category is the sovereign wealth fund. Because the United States does not run a surplus, in other words, it borrows to cover its expenses, a sovereign wealth fund would be financed with more of the same. Whether that sovereign wealth fund is used to just revalue the gold that the United States allegedly currently has, whether it's used to purchase cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, or whether it's used to purchase the means of the production of wealth, aka one of the planks of communism by Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, the state ownership of the production of wealth, all of these are funded through printing. And you might say, wait, if we just revalue the gold that we already have, that's not printing. And it is, because they're not going to sell the gold. They might use it to borrow against. So all of these things would either be accounting gimmicks or outright printing. To recap, underneath the printing bucket of solutions, we have quantitative easing by the Federal Reserve, bank deregulation to purchase more treasuries, the Fed buying up treasuries that are being dumped by other countries, and balance sheet gimmicks like gold revaluation and the sovereign wealth fund. As mentioned earlier, since all money is loaned into existence, all of these solutions are printing solutions. Right now, the United States has a debt to GDP ratio of around 120%, and the last time it was this high was from the spending from World War II. Following that peak, we saw the government deleverage itself, and the debt compared to the GDP ratio fell down to about 30%. It took about 40 years to do so, but that was an inflationary deleveraging, where the US government paired many of the policies that we discussed in this video in order to offload the pain of its debt onto the US economy. In other words, the US went through an inflationary deleveraging. But right around 1980, the government reversed course and started borrowing again because interest rates finally started to drop. The government levered up for the next 40 years until we peaked in 2020. This is the long-term debt cycle at work, and we have just started the next phase of the cycle, and it looks like we are having another inflationary deleveraging. The growth of the national debt, if all of these things we talked about today are employed, will slow down, meaningfully so, compared to the dollar value of the economy, meaning the debt to GDP ratio will fall, maybe even back down to its 30% levels from 40 years ago at the bottom of the last cycle. But make no mistake, this will be an inflationary deleveraging, even if paired with tax cuts, and even if it's paired with tax spending, and even if it's paired with deregulation. Prices will be higher than they would have been otherwise, and the government itself will be deleveraging, but only as a percentage of the national debt compared to the size of the economy, which means you must be invested in inflation-protected assets, and you must have a plan to increase your income every single year faster than the pace of inflation. Otherwise, you will be treading water at best. If you'd like me to help you apply ideas like this to your portfolio so that you can grow your wealth throughout the inflation in excess of the inflation rate, but also be protected against crashes that happen along the way, click on the link in the description below. As always, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.